All right, so what was the biggest challenge you faced when starting out as a software engineer? So, the biggest challenge I faced was not grasping the fundamentals. And when I say fundamentals, I'm talking about I was learning Java at the time. So, things like, what is object-oriented programming? So, what are the basic terminology for that? There's polymorphism, there's encapsulation, there's inheritance. And I couldn't necessarily grasp the concepts because the way that it was explained in textbooks and the way the professor explained it, I couldn't relate it to anything. And one of the biggest challenges for me was actually putting it into layman terms. So almost like dissecting the concepts into more familiar things that I can grasp. So one of the things that I started doing was when I was learning object-oriented programming was I started to almost relate it to similar things. So when I was learning polymorphism, for example, I'm like, geez, this doesn't make any sense to me. And the way that I learned it was I said, okay, if I have a class of, say, triangle, and I know how to get the area for, say, like an isosceles triangle, which has two of the same sides, then I know that I could use the same method to calculate area, but then I would just pass in different parameters, right? So I used different ways to kind of almost like learn the concepts in a way that made sense for me. All right, the next question is, how did you develop your technical skills early in your career? Were there any resources or mentors that helped you along the way? All right, so one of the biggest things here is that my career started off at a pretty well-known place. I'm not going to mention it in this video. And it was completely different than school. So in school, we learned computer science. We learned the sciences behind computers and programming languages, as well as compilers and transpilers and things like that. We didn't necessarily learn software engineering principles, which is applying these software skills to building scalable applications and solutions. So the thing that I struggled with when I first came into my career was I didn't know how to build, full-scale systems. I didn't know how to apply what I learned in school and translate that into what I was doing at the company. So in order to develop my technical skills, I tend to learn by example. So I used a lot of the resources at my company. I found someone that was a great mentor to me, senior engineer, and he was able to help me through and understand different concepts like dependency injection and Maven, and all that stuff that you're going to use when you're working at a large company. So in order to develop my technical skills, I spent a lot of time reading, especially online and textbooks, and just really grasping the concepts of software engineering. So I'll give you one example. I was tasked with one task at my company to build a portal where we could track our hardware. We didn't have a way to track different hardware. And in order to do that, I had to learn how to write a web-based server. Then I had to learn how to do, link that to a database system. So kind of building things that are kind of already automated in a way. So we have things like Swagger that kind of get this done for us behind the box. But at the time, we didn't really have a way to do that. So learning those skill sets and picking those things up was one of the main things. So spending a lot of time reading, learning on my own, and YouTube became my best friend. I would go home, I would learn things on my own. I still remember just getting home from work, or even if I was on the train, I'd be learning this new concept that I just picked up at work. And building scalable solutions isn't something that comes very easily to me. It may come easily to some of you, but kind of picking up those skills, learning them on my own was important. The second thing that I did was I just Googled everything. So this is before generative AI and stuff like that. I just Googled the crap out of everything. So if someone mentioned a term that I had no idea what it meant, I would just Google it. And I'd spend time learning it. And then I became an expert at it again. So it's just I just kept this growth mindset throughout my time and just spent it learning as much as I can. And That even applies. So it's been what, 10 years, 11 years since I graduated, and I've been working at this company, and I spend the majority of my time just learning new skill sets. I mean, in this field, you never actually stop learning. So that's what I did. I continue to learn, and two is I find people that are levels beyond me, and I'm just not afraid to ask questions. It's like, I still remember when I was a junior engineer, the mentor that I found, I would ask him things like, hey, this is my design. What do you think? And even if this person didn't have time, which thank you for taking the time, I'll thank him later. He took the time to review my design and give me feedback and input and make sure that I was doing the right things. So don't be afraid to ask questions. Just question everything. Ask people, hey, what is it that I should do here? And if you don't know, try to bounce ideas off online. Feel free to get input from people on X or on YouTube. Like, just go out of your way to make sure that you're learning in the best way possible. Software engineering is constantly evolving. How do you stay up to date with new technologies and frameworks? All right, this is a great question because software engineering is constantly changing. And 10 years ago, even though we did have artificial intelligence, it wasn't in the way that it's used now with these large language models and generative AI. So in order to stay up to date, I mean, I follow people on X and YouTube, and I just kind of stick with the pulse. I just see what's coming up and learn those technologies. And even through coworkers, we'll talk about new designs, try to build in new technologies that come up. So a concrete example is, I remember there was a big push to move everything into the cloud. So for a long time, we were hosting our services in bare metal. And if you remember those days, you would just package up your application and you would have to request some hypervisor of some sort. You would have to push your application to run there. And there were a lot of issues with that in at least getting the resources that you needed. And I remember this big push to move everything to the cloud. That was like the rave, a couple years ago, maybe like 6-7 years ago. And in order to do that, we had to learn cloud technologies. We had to pick things up like Terraform and building these elastic sort of solutions so that we can scale our applications. And, that's one of the things that you have to do as a software engineer is just continue to just learn new things. And the way that I do that is I tend to just jump right in. So for example, for ChatGPT, for example, I mean, we've all been doing prompt engineering for a long time. How many times have you requested a feature and it just got done, right? And if you, as an engineer, you know how to break a problem down into manageable steps, that's basically what you can tell an AI to do. So one of the things that I did when like ChatGPT blew up and this whole thing came up is like, hey, what are the capabilities of these large language models? And one of the things I did was just start playing around with it. I mean, just dive into the technology. Another example was when Next.js came out. I remember I was, used to coding in React, and Next.js just kind of built this framework around building React applications, and I just jumped right in. I mean, it's so good to be able to pick up new technologies that build up on top of each other, and just make our lives that much easier. So my tip there, and hopefully this works for you as well, is to just jump in, start doing things and see how it works out for you. So the next question here is, do you follow a structured learning plan, or do you prefer to learn as new challenges arise? So this is a great question because I tend to lean more on the side of whatever interests me. So if I see something new come out, or it's something, I think of technology as almost like tools, right? So things like ChatGPT, it's a tool. Things like JavaScript and Java and, programming languages in general, they're just tools to solve a problem. So whenever I, have a new idea, I tend to just try to learn in that way. So it's like, what tools do I need to solve this problem? And if I have some sort of knowledge gap in that area, so say, for example, I'm building an application and I need to deploy to the cloud. Well, what do I need to do? Well, I need to build some cloud infrastructure. So I didn't know AWS. So time to learn Amazon Web Services. Then two is like, hey, how can I make this a little easier for myself? Well, I can use Terraform to build the infrastructure. All right, so now I need to dive in and learn Terraform. And then it's like, okay, great. So now that I have these two things, then I need to build this full scale web application. Well, what's available to me? Well, you could build it in React. You could build it with, Next.js. You could build it with any other new framework that comes out. And then it's up to you to figure out how to learn. So that's definitely what I do. I tend to just jump in, try to figure it out, use it as tools. And then if new challenges arise, then I jump in and try to figure things out. So it's not necessarily a structured plan. It's more about just diving in and just learning the technology. There's no need to make it as complicated as things seem. One thing that I will say as a tip that comes to my mind is that some documentation, especially in our practice and engineering, it tends to be very, not necessarily the best way to learn things. So things tend to seem a bit more complicated than they are. So they may use some words that don't necessarily make sense. And just to relate this to my earlier point is, like polymorphism or encapsulation. It's like, oh man, I can't relate that to anything. So it's figuring out how can you link new terms to existing things that you already know. And that will make your learning process much easier. All right, so the next question here is, how do you balance learning new skills while managing a demanding workload? Okay, this is a great question. So as an engineering manager, I found it less and less urgent for me to learn the new skill as it is to understand how it fits as a whole. So let me break that down a little bit. My job is pretty demanding, and I need to understand how many different systems fit into place. And also just being, almost like the senior architect of the team, I also need to understand how to build systems. How long is it going to take? Are there any issues that may arise, like the risk and concerns? So kind of balancing a lot of this stuff off. As new technologies come up, or as new teams, develop new products that we need to integrate into our platform, we need to be cognizant of that and aware, and also be able to learn and pick up these new skills. So one of the things that I do is I tend to learn exactly what's needed for at the time, while also keeping a pulse, which is like, say, for example, there's some new framework that comes out. It's like, okay, is this gaining traction? So for example, I'm just going to stick to the Next.js example. We've been using React, right? Great. So now is Next.js gaining traction? Are we going to use it at our company? If it's, we realize that it's not as valuable, then I'm not going to necessarily just jump in and try to learn that skill. I'll keep a pulse on it. I'll understand, what is it at the high level, but I'm not going to dive into the details. Another example of this is, say, for example, we're, migrating our applications into the cloud, and we're using Kubernetes, for example. Well, great. I'm going to keep a pulse on Kubernetes. I'm going to understand cloud infrastructure, but I'm not going to necessarily dive into the details. I'm going to stick to very high level, almost a medium level, understand how the systems work, how they relate to each other. How can I build my infrastructure, for example, like add load balancers, deploy cloud instances, but I'm not going to necessarily dive into the details on how to configure things and, what, for example, like user access and stuff like that. I'm not going to necessarily know about the policies and all that. I'm going to leave that to the teams that need to know how to do that, and they can advise me on the best way to go about that. So I guess my way of doing it is sticking at a high level. So if I think of it, I use this term a lot. It's like this T-shape engineer. You build a lot of breadth at the top. So you learn a lot of different technologies, how they work, how they fit together. And then whatever it is that, you're specializing in is what you dive deep into. So you may have multiple T's that come up, but you need to make sure that you're balancing that in the right way possible. All right, the next question here is, are there any specific strategies or frameworks you use to break down complex problems and learn efficiently? So I tend to think about learning as almost an opportunity for me to not only pick up a new skill, but become more valuable either at my company or at things that I'm building in my personal life. So, for example, YouTube is one of those things that I realized that I can improve my communication skills and my presentation skills by just doing that. So one of the frameworks that I like to use is I like to think in almost like systems. And I'm going to give you a concrete example about that. Whenever I'm explaining something to someone, and it's a really complex system, first I start at a very, very high level. So if we have 3 different processes, for example, that I need to explain, I'll first start off by saying, okay, on the left side, we have this data component, and we need data in order to ingest that into our application. So the second thing that I would describe here is we have our application, which is ingesting this data. This data needs to be transformed and made usable so that it can be used by downstream consumers. So now on the right side of that equation, I would then say, on the right side, we have our consumers, and they need the structured data in order to produce the necessary output that's required by their systems. And we don't really care about their systems. What we care about is, what's the data format that they're expecting. So now that I have these, say, for example, these 3 different methods or 3 different components, then I'll dive into the details of each. But if I give them this high level picture when I'm communicating, then it makes it a lot easier to digest that information. All right, the next question here is, how do you determine which skills or technologies to focus on next? And do you follow industry trends or personal interests? All right, so this is a mix of both. As I alluded to earlier, I tend to just kind of dive into the things that I find interesting. So for example, I just really love the way that Next.js and Vercel interacted. I felt like deploying an application in the past was pretty tedious. And I like the way that with Next.js, you could build something very quickly. And then there's a CLI with Vercel that you could just deploy an application. When it comes to industry changes, AI, generative AI and LLMs just coming in and just smashing through the market and changing the way that some industries operate, I do tend to want to learn those technologies. So I will dive in and figure out, what's going on? What can I build with this? Does this solve any existing problem? And I tend to go from there. So, going back to my point about these T-shapes, building that breadth, I tend to, strike a balance between the two. If it's required for my job, I tend to definitely, pick up that technology and learn it. But I also tend to ask a lot of questions to senior engineers and make sure that, I'm understanding concepts properly. So again, it's a mixture of both. I think, if you want to enhance your skills and learn things for yourself just to keep things interesting, then I totally recommend that you do that. However, if it's required for your company, then that's something that, you may just have to do. So for me, I tend to just, strike a balance between the two. All right, the next question here is, imposter syndrome is common in tech. How did you first experience it, and how did it affect your confidence? Okay, so imposter syndrome is very, very real. And I first felt it, the first time was in college. And then the second time was when I joined my first team out of college. So actually, it was even before that. It was when I started interning at the New York Stock Exchange. So I'll get into that. So when I was in college, I remember in my freshman year into the Intro to Java Programming course, I just could not for the life of me figure out any of the programming concepts like I mentioned before. Object-oriented programming just did not come naturally to me. And it took a while for things to click. But once they clicked, it was smooth sailing from there. So when I first got my internship, I remember I had to build some reporting tools, and I didn't necessarily understand again, how to build these large scale applications or how to fit into different code bases. And again, like YouTube we didn't have as much material as we do now. So one of the things that I had to do was just dive head in, ask questions, just trust the, senior engineers. And I felt like they were trusting me to build a system that I just had no idea how to do. And I found that extremely difficult. And it took a lot of coaching from senior engineers, as well as just really trusting myself to, just say, hey, I'm not going to know it all, but at some point I will. And, over time, now that I've been in the industry for a little over 10 years, I started realizing that not everyone knows everything. And, some people may speak very, very confidently about a topic, but if you challenge them and you ask them, why is this the way it is? Sometimes they'll even tell you, oh, I don't know that. So yeah, just be very, very aware of that. Like, just because you don't feel like you know something, trust that a lot of people don't really understand all the details behind it, but you can definitely pick something up. And I'll use an example for like cloud computing. I remember when I was building a bunch of Terraform scripts to build some infrastructure, I remember asking people just like, hey, what's the best way to do this? And a lot of people just didn't really know. I mean, I thought that I was doing it wrong. I was one of the so-called like experts on the team because I was, very interested in writing Terraform, but, I felt the imposter syndrome, and it's okay to feel the imposter syndrome, but you may very well be the person that just knows how to do something because you spent so much time doing it. So imposter syndrome is real. Just know that you're going to feel it, especially when you're challenged. I feel it now, even as a manager, and it's totally fine. I know that I'm building the skills necessary in order to achieve and be the best that I can be. And if you're doing that, then that's really all that matters. So the next question is, how did imposter syndrome show up in your day-to-day work? Did it impact your performance or interactions with colleagues? The answer is absolutely. Absolutely. When imposter syndrome showed up, for example, when I had to present about a particular topic that was very much complicated, not something that I can necessarily talk about in this video. It's very much internal to the company. I was stuttering. I felt like I did terrible. Even though at the end of the presentation, people thought it was fantastic, I still felt like, wow, I did not do a good job. I felt like I just didn't understand the material. I didn't really know it, as deep as I should have. However, just know that, it's going to be okay. So it definitely affects my interactions with colleagues. One of the other things that I notice, especially when I'm learning a new skill or learning about, say, for example, like the quantitative side of finance, for example, I tend to, that's not really my strong suit. And I feel like I need to know everything before I can ask someone a question. And that's where the imposter syndrome really kicks in. And one of the things I realized is that you can just start asking questions. You don't have to know it all. Feel free to just ask questions. And that's something that I've been doing a lot, is just saying, hey, I don't know what this is. Can you explain it to me? And that imposter syndrome over time does go away, and you start building a knowledge base, underneath that in order to support it. All right, the next question here is, what strategies have helped you overcome these feelings of inadequacy? Wow, great question. So I feel that trusting yourself, so number one is trusting yourself, and two is trusting the process, are the two most important things. So when you trust yourself, trusting yourself means that things are going to be okay. You can literally just tell yourself, hey, I don't know this thing right now. Things are going to be okay. And it's okay that I don't know it. And that has helped me because I love getting myself into uncomfortable situations. However, I know when I'm in an uncomfortable situation, I tend to start rethinking, like, did I make the right decision? Two is trusting the process. So when you trust the process, you just know that, hey, I'm not going to know everything. I will learn it. And just know that even as you're grinding it out, you're trying to figure things out. You're trying to learn, say, a new language. So say you're just learning to program and you learn Python. And now you're going to Java and you realize, geez, like this language is just completely different. It's you're going from what looks to be super simple syntax to like this super very opinionated language with a lot of types, and you need to understand all this and how to piece it together. Well, just know that if you trust the process, even if it takes 2 months, 3 months, or a year, just know that you will figure it out. You just have to continue to learn, continue. YouTube is your friend, ChatGPT is your friend. Just know that you can find ways to learn it and everything's just going to be okay. So those are the two strategies that I've used in order to overcome that. Do you think that imposter syndrome ever fully goes away, or do you learn to manage it better over time? I think that imposter syndrome never really goes away. However, I've definitely felt like I can manage it a lot better. So I definitely do agree with that. I think that, for example, at my company, I don't know it all, and I don't think I'll ever know it all. If I knew it all, I mean, maybe I'd be a genius. Maybe I could just launch my own company, right? So I think that imposter syndrome never goes, but, alluding, to my previous points about trusting yourself and then trusting the process, those are the two most important things that you can do. All right, so next question. As you progressed in your career, how did your approach to learning change? This is a great question. And I would say that as I progressed, I felt like I needed to understand more about how things fit into the bigger picture than I did in the past. So when I was a junior engineer, I felt like I could just dive in, just build a feature, and great, it was done. I didn't necessarily need to understand how things fit into the bigger picture. So say, for example, if I was building some sort of web application, I would just focus on one particular feature, like building out a text box and building the data source and, loading that data into that text field and then pushing that into the database, and great, like everything was done. But, as my career progressed, I needed to think about things like holistically. So like, how does this entire application fit into the bigger ecosystem? And then also thinking about, great, how do we scale this application? How do we build in new technologies or make sure that we're up to date with the latest things, as well as thinking forward. How do we transform this application? And this gets into, 8, maybe 10 years into the industry, is thinking through like, what's the vision for this product? What do we think about this product in the next 5 years, right? How is this product going to change? So I think that's, one of the biggest things is going from, down here, a very small feature set into a very large and wide vision. So the way that I apply this to learning is that I try to keep a lot more breadth than I do depth. And I had alluded to this earlier, where I was mentioning this T-shaped sort of like engineer, where you're learning a lot of different skills and then you're diving super deep into them. So when I, as my career has progressed, I realized that I need to understand how a bunch of different systems fit in together and not necessarily dive in super deep into the implementation details. I also need to understand how to architect things. How do we build something that's scalable? Sometimes we need to make trade-offs. Sometimes we need to take something that, would be perfect if we had 2 years to build it. And hey, we actually don't have 2 years. We have 3 months. We have 6 months to build this solution. So it's like, what trade-offs do we need to make? And as a junior engineer, one of the things that, as a skill, it's just like, hey, this is the feature I want to build. And, this is the right way to do it. And as a senior engineer, as you progress, you realize like, hey, we may have to build this a different way. We may need to pivot slightly in order to meet the deadline. So that's how I think about acquiring skills is, sticking to the breadth side of things and not necessarily having to dive so deep into the implementation details. All right, so the next question is, did moving into senior or leadership roles bring a new wave of imposter syndrome? How did you manage that transition? So moving into senior and leadership roles really does bring a new wave of imposter syndrome. It almost feels like there's a magnifying glass on you because now everyone is asking you questions and everyone is trusting that you have the solutions to everything. And I think that that new wave of imposter syndrome can be very, very real. However, some of the strategies that I use to manage that are that number one, I trusted myself, and two is I trusted the process. So one, by trusting myself is that, hey, look, I know I'm not going to know everything. I tell that to myself all the freaking time. It's like, hey, someone comes to me with some brand new technology and they want to, implement that into our system. Sometimes I don't know the answer to that. I can't tell them yes, no, because of, XYZ feature. However, what I can do is coach them through and see if they can answer it themselves. So with that imposter syndrome, I feel like I'm able to build more of a coaching side of things. That way I can empower people to kind of make decisions on their own. And this is one of the most important things that I've realized moving into senior leadership is that you need to be able to trust the people that you're working with and empower them so you can give them advice, but you need to empower them in order for them to be able to come up with right and great solutions. So that imposter syndrome is real, but if I trust myself, knowing that I'm not going to know everything, being upfront with people like that. And then two is just trusting the process, knowing that over time, this imposter syndrome will go away. Those two things have just helped me tremendously. So the next question is, how do you encourage your team to keep learning and growing? And this is a great question. And my answer to that, and hey, look, this may change in 10 years, but my answer to that is showing them why. And Simon Sinek has a great TED Talk on this. He even has a book, Start with the Why, is telling them why their work matters. And I think by telling the team the reason why they're doing the work, I feel like people are way more empowered to just continue to learn, to just want to strive to do better. So when people understand the impact of the work that they're doing, I feel like they're almost like innately motivated to try to do the best work that they can while also wanting to pick up and learn new skills. So that is one of the biggest things that I do is whenever something comes up, if we're implementing some new feature, we're releasing a new application, we're doing some migration to the cloud or something, I always tell them why. I tell them the impact first. Like, why are we doing this? We're doing this because XYZ. These are the benefits that we're going to get. This is the impact of your work. And if someone says, hey, well, I don't know what I'm doing here, well, great. This gives you the opportunity to learn it. And this is how I try to motivate people and try to get them to really understand how their work fits into the bigger picture. And that way they can acquire the skills necessary in order to accomplish their tasks and their goals. All right, the next question is, what's your advice for engineers who feel that they're not ready for leadership positions? My advice is, you're never going to feel ready. And if people are beginning to trust you or they come to you with a lot of questions and they want your opinion, then you're ready without even realizing it. And this is a lot of what has happened with me is that I still don't feel like I'm necessarily a leader in any way. I still feel like, hey, I'm working on a problem. I'm trying to solve it. But I do know how to coach people. I do know how to get them to think about a problem in a different way. And a lot of that comes to just letting people speak and also asking them, well, why do you think this solution will work? Are there any trade-offs? Are there any risks? Are there any concerns? So these are ways that you can empower people to do things. And if people are coming to you, just bringing this back to, people that don't feel ready, if people are coming to you already, you're ready for it. I don't feel ready. However, I know I'm ready at the same time because people have always leaned towards asking me questions and making sure that, at least my thought process aligns with theirs. So that's my advice. You're never going to feel ready. But if people are already coming to you, if you're already a trusted person, if your opinion matters, you're ready. So just go for it. That imposter syndrome will go away. Remember the two things: trust yourself and trust the process, and you'll be golden. All right, so we're going to move on into advice for new engineers. So What advice would you give to someone just starting their software engineering journey who's feeling overwhelmed or doubting their abilities? My advice is, first, don't give up. Do not give up. It's so easy to give up. And I am very much guilty of that. I still remember when I was in college, freshman year, intro to Java programming, I just wanted to give up. I was just so overwhelmed. I was just like, what is system.out.println and the parentheses and all the quotes and the semicolons? And it's like, whoa, like this is code. That's exactly what I noticed. It's like, hey, this is what I chose to do. However, it was so overwhelming because nothing made sense. And if you want to use a practical example here, just imagine you're learning a new language. Say you're learning Spanish. Say you're learning Japanese. Say you're learning Russian, and you realize like, whoa, there's a new alphabet, all these new characters that I need to learn in order to be able to construct sentences. It's the same thing in software engineering. You're constructing a bunch of new ways of doing things in patterns that aren't necessarily very familiar to us, right? So, using the language example, it takes time. It takes time to learn a new language. With software engineering, you're learning new languages, new technologies, new ways of building systems. You need to understand how architecture fits in. There's a lot of new jargon and terminology that you need to learn, and it's pretty difficult. So just don't give up. Don't give up. So, if you don't give up, you need to trust yourself. And I've mentioned this before. So if you don't give up, you begin to trust yourself because you're saying, hey, I know that I could do this. Even if it takes me a year or 2 years or 3 years to learn something, but I'm putting in the effort to do it, at some point it clicks. And you need to trust yourself. You need to trust the process. And the second one, which I just mentioned, is trusting the process. Just know that eventually it clicks. It's like once you take a break from something or you go on vacation, you're trying to learn how to, shoot a basketball. And then you take a break and you come back and then you realize like, whoa, like, wow, I'm really hitting this right now. Like what just happened? What changed? And it's because you allowed yourself, your body, your brain to actually process what exactly was going on. So that's one thing I urge you to do is, take breaks between learning bouts, make sure that you're optimizing that so that you're able to build the skill sets that you need. And then the last thing that I would do is once you feel like someone understand what you're doing, try to teach it to someone. Try to teach it to someone right away. And the reason for that is because if you can build the comprehension to teach someone the skill, then you know that you have mastered, not necessarily mastered, but that you understand, that you've grasped the concepts required in order for you to explain to someone or teach someone that skill. And don't go, if you're learning programming and you're learning object-oriented programming, don't go to someone that understands programming. Try to teach it to someone that doesn't understand it and see if they can regurgitate that information back to you. And if you notice any holes in their learning or anything that doesn't quite necessarily make sense, then you can, go back to the drawing table and relearn those gaps that you missed. That way you're able to explain it better the next time. So those are my advice to people that are struggling or people that are, learning to code in software engineering and feel overwhelmed with that. All right, there's another question. If you could go back and give your younger self one piece of advice about learning and overcoming imposter syndrome, what would it be? What I would tell myself is exactly what I just said, which is I would first tell myself, don't give up. And I'm so glad that I never gave up because giving up is easy. When things get hard, if you think about it, as a cliff, you're climbing the mountain and you're trying to get there. At some point, you may tell yourself like, hey, I haven't reached the summit. I'm going back down. But it's those people that hit the summit, coming back down is just so much easier, right? I mean, you made it, you feel great, and now you can just climb down to the other side. So the way I think about it is, hey, just don't give up. Don't give up. 2 is trust yourself. So if I trust myself that I can do something, I'm going to feel that much more empowered to continue to pursue it. So when it came to software engineering, once I got into my sophomore year, I loved programming. I went from like, oh my God, I'm never going to get this. This thing is just way too hard, to now suddenly I'm telling myself like, man, I love this thing. Imagine the potential. What can I create with just Java alone? I love the fact that I was able to build a game in school, and I realized the power of learning to program. So that's one of the beauties of doing it. It's because, not giving up and trusting myself, I was able to do that. And then the third thing that I mentioned before also was just trusting the process. It's eventually it clicks. Things start to make sense. And that goes with anything. That goes with anything. If you're learning a new language, you realize like, I don't necessarily know everything, but eventually things start to click. You trust the process. You take a break, you come back, you practice and practice and practice, and eventually you learn. So that's my advice. Okay, so last question is, any final words of encouragement for engineers struggling with self-doubt or feeling stuck in their learning journey? So my final words are, trust yourself. Know that we're in a field that is very difficult. It may be easy for some. I don't want to discount those people. However, for many of us, I feel that tech and software engineering, computer science aren't things that just come easy and naturally, right? Like the arts or, playing a sport or something may be a bit more natural to some of us. I feel like computer science is something that not necessarily everyone can learn and pick up very easily. And my words of encouragement is, I struggled a lot to learn this stuff, but eventually I was able to pick it up. I was able to trust the process. I put in my hours, a ton of hours to learn things. I used the resources available to me. I talked to a lot of people. I trusted senior engineers, got mentors. I mean, just use what's around you in order to learn. So my advice is, don't give up and trust the process, because eventually things are going to click. And I'm here to answer any questions you have. And if you need some supporting words, feel free to just ask me questions. That is it. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. Peace.